After the tune, an interview with Dr. Reggie Gazes of Bucknell University on teaching and scholarship in comparative primate cognition.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh of Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and the podcast is brought to you by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University's Center for the Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior. For this episode, I sat down in the studio with Dr. Reggie Gazes and my colleague next door, Dr. Ikuma Adachi, to talk about comparative primate cognition. Reggie was visiting our research institute with a few undergraduate students as part of a training and exchange program hosted by Ikuma in his lab. Reggie is an associate professor of psychology and animal behavior at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. She and Ikuma overlapped as trainees in the lab of Dr. Robert Hampton at the now named Emory National Primate Research Center. We had Rob in episode number 20 of the podcast for anyone who might be interested when we talked about mental time travel and metacognition. Ikuma is on that show as well, along with some other excellent guests talking about animal cognition. But in the interview here, we find out how her experiences in Rob's lab translated into Reggie's own approach to being a teacher scholar at Bucknell University. I loved her enthusiasm and energy when she was speaking about engaging her students through research in primate cognition. And I already had that sense, actually, from a few prior interactions and from the fact that she was here in Japan supporting some undergraduates in this training opportunity. So I did something a little unorthodox. I canvassed them for some questions. And so the interview itself can be thought of as a sort of collaboration with them. And wow, did they help me load the deck. So along with Reggie riffing on Bunny the dog, teaching students like she trains her monkeys, and spoiler alert, why she won't go to karaoke with her students here. Sorry, folks. We talk at length about the nuts and bolts of doing comparative cognitive science, and particularly in the context of animals in social groups. In a seminar she did for us at Kyoto University, Reggie told us about her studies looking at how different individuals are better or worse at learning certain tasks and how these relate to their social contexts, like what rank they occupy in the group or how embedded they are in their social networks. We'll link to some of those in the show notes. But these are the kind of things that would really matter to individual primates living under natural conditions. So it was great hearing Reggie's thoughts on how this type of cognitive experimentation was gaining more and more traction, despite its many challenges. Listening to this interview, I think you'll come away as I did with a sense that Reggie's a really caring and thoughtful teacher scholar, and hopefully you'll learn a lot from the various lessons she and Ikuma share here. And hey, her department is hiring, so if you think all this sounds great and she'd make a wonderful colleague, then get in touch with her. She provides a few details toward the end of the interview. Links again in the show notes. So I'm really excited to share this conversation with all of you. So to do that, here are Reggie and Ikuma in the studio with yours truly. I want to throw like a weird off-the-wall question to you to get started, which is, and I'm not going to lie, I didn't come up with this myself, but what's the deal with Bunny the dog?
We were just talking about Bunny the dog.
Really?
Yeah. Well, so you know who Bunny the dog is?
I have no idea who Bunny the dog is.
Okay. So Bunny the dog is a very famous TikTok dog who uses these buttons to communicate. So buttons that say like outside or bunny or food or whatever it happens to be. And so this has gotten a lot of press. People love watching Bunny the TikTok dog, and it comes up in classes a lot. So animal behavior courses or comparative cognition courses, my students always want to talk about Bunny the dog. And of course, it's, a really interesting example of one of those cases where we have like this one animal doing this thing that seems so incredible, but we don't have any of the science to tell us exactly what's going on, right? So like we don't know how Bunny was trained, and we don't have footage of Bunny every day for her whole life to know, how much of this is we only get to see the one time she produces something that makes sense out of 4,000 times they don't make sense. How much of it is specific reinforcement of sequences, right, which we know animals can do. And there are some scientists now who are working on this question because these buttons have become highly available. You can order them on Amazon. People have their cats using them, their dogs using them. So I know there's some folks in the dog world who are working on trying to answer these questions. But yeah, it's definitely a fun topic to get students into conversations around communication and training and even like research methodology because it's kind of fun.
Okay. So I hadn't heard of Bunny, but I do know, and I use a little bit in my comparative cognition class, the story of Stella, the dog, which is maybe the better known example of this, but is this kind of the same idea?
Yeah, I think it's pretty, it's kind of like speaking to a new generation. And like Chaser, the dog, Rico, right? So these are like very specific one animal who can do this like amazing thing, right? And that always comes up in comparative cognition when you're thinking about, capacity versus like abilities and whether one animal doing a thing tells us that that species has this particular cognitive capacity or whether that's really just like a one-off anecdote, right? And as they say, the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So, we need better studies to really understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I think, so in addition to Reggie here in the studio, we have Ikuma Adachi again with us, who's kind of hosting during this time. We'll get into that in a second. But I think with the chimpanzees as well here, you have kind of similar storylines too. Like you might have some, what you could call quote unquote savant chimpanzees out there. And I wonder if you want to make any comments on that as well.
Well, I guess it's really important point brought by Reggie now, like capacity versus like what is going on as a species, for example. But I mean, both are important line of studies as far as it's scientifically approached, I would say. So Rico's case or those other good examples, the first things they came is basically just phenomena. They seem to have this. And then the question is whether or not they actually do that. Or they just happen to show the similar phenomena by totally different mechanisms. So we really need to understand what is behind those behaviors. People can easily answer morphize. Oh, I cannot say that. You can say that.
Anthropomorphize.
Anthropomorphize their behavior. And then we try to understand their behavior based on our own cognition or cognitive systems. But that's sometimes bringing you a wrong direction.
Right.
So scientifically, we need to approach and we need to understand what is behind. So in that sense, chimp study, yes, we are also often based on a small number of subjects. But still, we want to take it as a group as much as we can. But meanwhile, even if it's a limited example, we want to understand what they can do as a capacity that they have. So both questions we actually are interested in.
So I know dogs, Reggie, is not really your main study species, but I'm kind of, just to belabor the point a little bit more, I know that recently there's been kind of a renaissance in research with dogs, particularly in the realm of cognition. And I wonder, just from your perspectives as comparative cognitive scientists, how do you see that, like the origins of that, and why did it kind of take so long for people to get really interested in this, given, how familiar they are to us? It's kind of an interesting, I think, development.
Yeah, it is weird, actually. You're right that it took so long to get there because people are really interested in dogs. And then, the flip side of that, too, is very few people are looking at cats in cognition. I think in part that's just practical. Cats are very difficult to work with. The friends that we have that work with them, it's a struggle. But these animals that we spend so much of our daily lives with, we actually don't know all that much about. And I think in part the interest in dog cognition now, of course, it's related to the fact that humans love dogs and they are such a part of our lives. But I think there's also a lot of practical reasons why a lot of folks have moved to dogs. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do research with primates in captivity and to get access to any animals, right? It's very expensive. A lot of facilities are shutting down. And so looking for study species that you can access easily that are of interest from either an evolutionary perspective or domestication perspective or just a human welfare and interaction perspective, dogs are a great option there. So I think there's a lot of layers to why the dog stuff has gotten so popular lately.
Agreed. I mean, and also again, I think we humans sometimes overconfident about we understand their behavior because they do something that you want.
Yeah.
But again, if you come to the evolutionary perspective or domestication perspective, as Reggie said, we need to understand their behavior and mechanism, what make them do that. So it can be very interesting species in that sense, and practical reason too. So that's how the public attention and scientific interest can come together, I think.
Okay, so enough about dogs.
Poor dog.
So I want to talk a little bit about why you're here, Reggie, and we can hear from Ikuma on that as well. But so you arrived here, I think it was at maybe the beginning of July or late June. You have a contingent of undergrads as well from Bucknell University. You yourself in the past were one of those undergrads at Bucknell University, so that might come up as well. But can you just give us a brief summary of what you're doing here?
Yeah, so there's 4 undergraduate students with me on this trip. We got a grant in 2019 from the Asia Network, which is a consortium of institutions in the States that are interested in promoting the liberal arts in Asia, basically. And so they have these student faculty fellow grants that you can apply for, where the students and the faculty work together to develop a project to go somewhere in Asia to study something. And so our project idea at the time was we have this group of undergraduate students who work at the primate facility at Bucknell. So we have a primate lab on campus, which is pretty unique for a primarily undergraduate institution. And all of these students have been working there, doing research, and obviously taking courses in how we study animal behavior and cognition in the States. But we got really interested in understanding a little bit more about the differences and the similarities in how primatology is studied in Japan. Because the history there of primatology in Japan and in the West, kind of developed in parallel for a while, but independent of one another, and then came together. And I think there are some differences in the way questions are asked and the way data are interpreted, the way the animals are treated and the spaces that we were really interested in exploring. And so we were supposed to be here in the summer of 2020 for many reasons. That didn't happen. And we are here now in the summer of 2023. So we've been shadowing Ikuma's students, who have been awesome, showing us around, letting us observe their experiments, and then also working on developing some long-term collaborative ideas that Ikuma and I have been working to develop since 2017, probably. To try to get some more exchange between our students and our facilities.
So I think you can imagine that we'd be really interested in people's perceptions of how kind of science is being done similarly and differently in these different places. We had formerly Pamela Asquith, who's an anthropologist, a metaprimatologist who studied the history of primatology and kind of philosophy of how the science was being done in these two places. And she herself spent a number of, or a good amount of time in Japan observing primatologists, going to the field with them, and then writing about these kind of differences. But from your perspective, and maybe on the more comparative cognition side, what were the kind of things that interested you most in that respect?
Well, yeah. So, we're focusing pretty much on comparative cognition, captive primate kind of cognitive work. And I think the things that my students got the most interested in were basically the line between humans and animals, right? And where do you draw that line? And which direction do you approach the science from, right? So when we think about cognitive questions, there's a few ways we can approach them, right? So we can come at it from humans do this thing, do chimpanzees also do this thing, right? Sort of, are we more similar than we might think, right? And there's a lot of amazing research questions that kind of come out of that perspective. And then there's also the opposite side of things, which is, how do animals solve things? How do humans solve things? And often where that lands you is that maybe humans aren't as great as we think they are at certain things, right? That like we often overcomplicate what humans are actually doing, and that it may be a little bit simpler. And so we've explored this and read a lot of Western primatologists and comparative psychologists talking about these differences. But when you look at the history of primatology in Japan and the way that primatology started and the amazing ideas of how to study animals that have come out of the work in Japan, like naming animals, right? Like it's this really basic one, but it's such a different perspective, right? It implies that these animals are individuals that have individual behaviors that are relevant, that they're part of a collective group, right, that act together, and that's also relevant, versus kind of the Western historical tradition of at least cognitive work, like Harlow and that, where maybe the animals don't have names and they're not particularly interesting. They're models of something that you're asking. And so I think that was something that our students had a real interest in, was just this perspective of like animals and the continuum of animals and humans.
Anecdote on that. I was just listening recently to an interview with John Mitani on the Talking Apes podcast, another kind of primatology adjacent or related podcast. And he was talking about the original naming of the Ngongo chimpanzee. So talking about Chimp Empire, this Netflix documentary. And so they were originally named after jazz musicians. I think he and David Watts started started research at Ngongo, and eventually they ran out of, I guess, jazz musicians that they knew or famous jazz musicians. But so that leads to a different kind of problem, cognitive issue that humans might have about that. In Japan, there are different systems, like on Koshima, where primatology was started in Japan. I think historically, and certainly now, females and males are named differently. So the females are given plant names and the males are given animal names. And that seems to have been persisting for quite some time. I don't know if it's right from the beginning. That's really interesting. Yeah. And so I wonder, I don't know, Ikuma, if you know, like how the chimpanzees here were named.
Here, I don't know.
Okay.
Some of them are named after the actress. That's what I know. For example, Ai is named after the famous actress on the time. But some of them actually came with a name already. So we don't name everyone, every single individual here. But I mean, for the infant-wise, it's clear. Just we pick the name starting from the same character, basically, from the mother.
Right.
So that we can keep track, the lineage, family lineage based on that.
Right. Ai and Ayumu.
Yeah, for example, Pan and Pao.
Pan and Pao, yeah. Koe and Kuyo.
Yes.
Yeah, that's our practice too in our lab as well.
Yeah, so maybe you can talk then about the primate lab that you have at Bucknell. Now, I think I heard you mention that it has kind of an interesting origin story.
Yeah, if it's accurate.
Oh, right. That's accurate.
Yeah, so this is one of those like apocryphal things. Like I've never seen it in print, so I'm not positive it's true.
Okay.
But the story goes that the reason we have a primate lab at Bucknell is that Doug Candlin, who started our program, was an animal behaviorist, primatologist, that he got a call from Carpenter, who had been in Japan after World War II doing some work with scientific development, and that I guess the government of Japan had offered him as a thank you a troop of Japanese monkeys. And he didn't know where to put them, so he called Doug and said, would you take these monkeys? And he went to the university and said, hey, would you build me an enclosure for monkeys? And that began the whole thing. Like I said, don't know if that's true. But now we don't have Japanese macaques anymore. I'm not actually sure what happened to the original troop. We have a group of Hamadryas baboons. We have a group of tufted capuchin monkeys, and we have a group of squirrel monkeys. So total, we have about 50 monkeys on campus, and they're involved in teaching. So our students take courses in the lab. We have classrooms there doing behavioral observations, cognitive research, and then they're also they support the research for the faculty and for the students there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that perspective. So I know a lot of our perceptions might be that labs like that, primate labs, are there to support the research activities of the faculty and whoever, collaborators and students as well, graduate students. But you just mentioned that they're also an important teaching tool. And I'm not sure I've heard that so often, that it's as integrated. So is that really like a focus then of the department too, so that this is really an important teaching opportunity and role for that place as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, so Bucknell, it's a primarily undergraduate institution, which means while we have a master's degree program, we don't have PhD students. We don't really have postdocs to speak of. There's a few. So the research that happens on campus is done by the undergraduate students working with the faculty. And the faculty's main job is teaching. So we teach undergraduate courses. And so integrating our scholarship into our teaching is a big part of what we do. So our Bucknell has an animal behavior major, which is very old. I think we're at 55 years, maybe longer than that the major's been around. And it's an interdisciplinary program between the biology department and the psychology department. And it really focuses on behavior. And the primates have just always been a big part of that. And so our students, like I said, take courses in that. And that's very important for us that they get that kind of training and experience. But they're also heavily involved in the lab. So we have a student training team who works with our primates doing like the husbandry training. And that's amazing because lots of our students want to go on to zookeeper work or, animal training stuff so they can get that experience as undergraduate students. We have a lot of pre-vet students that want time working with students with the animals. And then, of course, the research. So we have many students, like the 4 that are here, that are interested in the scholarship side of things too.
Right. So maybe this is something where the two of you, by the way, you've kind of known each other for a really long time, right? So we can digress for a second. You were graduate students together. Is that correct? Or you were a postdoc?
I was a postdoc in the same university.
Yeah, I was a baby grad student. Yeah. I think it was my second year that you got there as a postdoc. We worked together for a few years. Right next to each other in a tiny little lab.
That was in the lab of Rob Hampton.
Yes. At Emory National Primate Research Center.
Currently,
right.
Yes.
Oh, currently.
Has
it
changed
was
names.
the Yakis National Primate Research Center,
right.
but it's changed the name to the Emory State National Primate Research
think
Center or
it's still
Emory Primate Research Center.
I don't know. We apologize, Emory, for screwing that up.
We'll get that in the show notes later. Make sure we don't misrepresent the place. But I met Rob. He came here in 2014 for an animal psychology conference that we had in Inuyama that Tetsuro Matsuzawa put on, and he did a little interview for us for the PrimateCast as well. But super interesting guy and super fascinating research. So what maybe both of you can kind of riff on what you felt the experience was like working with Rob and the kind of opportunities you had in the lab there. Sure, Reggie, let's start with you.
It was awesome. I was Rob's first grad student. Ben Basil and I were the first 2. We came in together. And then Ikuma was the first postdoc. And so for a long time, the lab was really just the 3 of us and our research technicians. And we had just a ton of opportunities to really do what we wanted. We got to work with the rhesus monkeys in the lab. Rob set up sound attenuating booths for Ikuma's research projects. He supported me in my completely insane idea to set up touchscreens for the big social groups of rhesus at the field station, which was something I always wanted to do, but never thought I'd get a chance to do. And he made it happen, and that was amazing. I think, and we got a chance to work at the zoo and meet Sarah Brosnan, meet the whole crew at Georgia State. We worked really closely with them too. So I don't know, it was really great.
Same here. And he's very energetic and sincere in the science, which affect a lot to my career, I think, and how you want to operate a lab. Also, I learned a lot from him.
Oh, yes.
He has no hesitation to spend with the students. Spend time with the students to discuss each topic and also think about the future plan together. And he is always supportive. So I really learn a lot from him. And as Reggie mentioned, he also helping us to the networking with the people in the States, in Atlanta more specifically, but not only in the States. Not only in Atlanta. Whenever you join a conference together, he's just introducing people always to you and or introducing you to the old people basically. So that's a really amazing experience I got there.
Yeah, I had that sense that he had this kind of very gregarious nature.
Yeah. And we really, I think, what Ikuma just said about what we learned from Rob, the methodology and the careful way of thinking about data and of making sure to run follow-up experiments so that you're really clear on what it is that's going on, I think was something that we all got out of that experience and has definitely shaped the way that we all ask our research questions. I remember somebody once told me, they said, Rob Hampton is one of the only scientists who's famous for careful methodology rather than exciting findings.
Right.
And I really think that that's a really good way to explain it, that you can always trust that something that he says is accurate and has been vetted 1,000 times with 1 million experiments. And I think we all strive for that based on that experience.
Yeah, I think I remember a paper he published that was in response to the various criticisms of this metacognition work that he'd done. And I think in the paper, it was something like we set up these 11 experiments or something to follow up all the potential. And even at the end of it, he still sounds very measured and is not trying to say this is exactly right, but this is, we've, excluded all of these other possibilities. So
he's really sincere in the science.
Yeah.
Well, when I was young, right after I start my postdoc, I feel sometimes like it's too much or a little bit tiring or, because I want to just publish paper, but like never ever reached agreement.
No.
But that helped you a lot.
Yeah.
How to think about data, how to think about your methodology. And later on, just I like it more and more. And well, to be honest, I want to do the same way to my students too, but sometimes we still have a pressure to like publish paper and bringing up the major effect first and then open to the whole society to think about it. That's more or less like that I am shifting to, but still the way that he approached to the question is one of the greatest attitude I have ever seen. And I really admire that.
Though you're right. I don't think we ever published a paper with less than 4 experiments, which, as a grad student is so frustrating because you're like, I've done so much work. This was like 5 years of work. It's 1 paper. But it was like, you have to tell the whole story and you have to have all the follow-ups. And it's definitely, taken into the way that we all do our science now.
And how about the way you do your mentoring? So now you talked about coming here to Japan with I find that story itself fascinating. You have this undergraduate program, and in the way you talked about it earlier, you made it sound as well that the undergrads had these things that they were interested in, just that you were telling them they should be interested in. And so I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. So what is your experience working at this primarily undergraduate institution where you have this primate lab doing cognitive experiments, and they're all part of that while being trained, but also doing some of the research?
Oh, it's great. So obviously I chose that particular position because I have an interest in working with undergraduate students. As you said, I went to Bucknell, so I was really lucky to work with Peter Judge, who is the other primatologist, though he's retiring this year.
Oh, no.
So, and he was my mentor when I was an undergraduate student, and taught me so much about everything, right? About animal behavior and experiments and research questions that let me then go on to grad school, right? And ask the questions that I was able to ask after that. And so I know how valuable that can be. So it's been really fun. Working with undergraduate students is awesome. Like, they're so enthusiastic. They come up with great experiment ideas. So many of the coolest things that I've done since getting my faculty position have been because of undergrads who got excited about ideas. So we got started down this path of looking at cortisol, particularly in hair cortisol, because Ali Schrock, who is now a grad student at Duke working with Christine Dre, she was interested in that. And she was working in my lab and she was like, could we make that happen? I don't know, can we? And so we figured it out. Some of the social networking stuff that we do, that was really driven by Meredith Lutz, who is a PhD student now at UC Davis, who was just really interested in networking and figured out how to set it up for the lab and taught the rest of us. And we all kind of ran from there. So it's just like having grad students, really. Like, they drive a lot of the cool questions that you get to ask and take you in directions you never thought you'd go. And it's also kind of fun because you get to help them make some life decisions. The sad part is most of them don't end up going into science. Right. I think you train PhD students, a lot of them will kind of stay in the sciences. So you don't always get to see them again, at your professional meetings and things, but it's fun.
But how do you approach that then? Because I think maybe for us at primarily research institutions where we mostly interact with graduate students, I think a lot of times the expectation is, as you say, that at least a large proportion of folks who kind of are invested in the idea of staying in the academy to some degree. I think that's changing. And obviously the competition for jobs is such that it's unrealistic to expect that everybody's going to have that path, and nor should they. I think we should maybe stop having that expectation that people must do a PhD to become a professor. There are many other reasons why you might want to do that. But do you feel like you have to take a different approach with undergrads, or how do you then help them see through working with you and working in a primatology lab the other kind of skill sets that they're building that they can use towards whatever future career they might have?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it varies student to student, right? But we're at a liberal arts institution. We very heavily push the idea that like having a well-rounded education is just going to make you qualified to go out into the real world and get a job and have a life, right? And being a competent interpreter of science is just part of that, right? And so, I mean, I know you share the interest in science communication, right? So I've always been interested in science communication. And in some ways, there's no better way to do that than to teach people how to interpret science, right? Because when you do it yourself, then you go out and you see some news piece 10 years after you graduate when you're an investment banker, you know how to say like, I'm going to critically think about this before I take this for just the face value, right? So I think a lot of it is just the mentality of like, we are training people to be humans who understand information and understand how to make decisions and how to evaluate facts. And that's just part of science in general. But yeah, other than that, you just try and get students who are interested in what you do and get them interested in the questions that you're asking. And I think that usually does it.
Yeah, especially when they're the ones that came up with those.
Right, often, yeah. And, of course, like with grad students too, right, it's a lot of shaping because, students come up with great ideas or big ideas that aren't necessarily feasible or that have already been answered or that, just like you could never answer. You have to shrink the questions down into little bits and pieces. But that's the fun part, right?
That's a great learning experience.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to have in your mind as a goal, you have to think about how to approach it step by step or part by part.
What about you, Ikuma? So you, as I mentioned already, we mostly are dealing with graduate students here in Inuyama campus, Kyoto University. But do you have that conversation too with some about, whether folks want to continue in academia or not? And
especially recently, I have never ever tried to make them believe that they have to be in academia. Because there's so many pathways that they can take. But I still want to encourage them to keep interested in a science at least. And what is your question and how you want to approach it? It can vary across all people and students. So it's very difficult for me to just uniform the idea. I don't want to even do that.
Sure.
And so instead of really teaching them what should and what they should approach, but instead I just more casting so many information, including journal reading club, for example, just grab whatever you are interested in and share with other people and discuss in science and scientific language too. And hopefully just it can encourage them to just, have their own, find their own interest and dig into that and also keep the broader interest as a scientific, approach. And that's what I kind of try to do now.
The broad interest is so important. It's one of the reasons why SciCasp started the Inuyama Nerds that we had many years ago. It had this idea where, following Nerd Night, I don't know if you know Nerd Night, but it's like something that was started in the United States by some folks who are interested in communication, science communication. It could be art communication, it could be whatever. But they organized these events at a bar or cafe or something, and you would have a set of speakers on various different topics, and folks would go and have fun drinks and food. And we started that here in our cafeteria in some evenings. And the idea was really, we don't focus so much on your academic research field or studies, but pick some students from our graduate student body will volunteer and just organize an event. They'll pick a few speakers. Maybe the event is on death. And so you have a few speakers talking about different aspects of death. Maybe the event is on time. And so one of our organizers brought in a teacher from a local international school from Nagoya who was a physicist to talk about relativity. I don't remember exactly what the topic was, but things like that, right? So the idea is that people can actually spend time and focus on things that are not their science, but still have a bit of an academic bent or, a way we can teach each other about the things we're interested in. And I just think things like that seem so valuable. Yeah. But especially for graduate students, we tend to specialize so much that it's hard to kind of get outside of that and realize these other things that we bring to the table. Yeah. So I guess with undergrads, it's still a bit different because the folks are still quite young and just really formulating who they are, who they want to be. And so it's kind of an exciting time as well.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite. It's, you have graduate students who are so focused and so into their science, right? That's all they think about. With undergraduates, when they start in the lab, oftentimes they literally don't know anything about the science, right? They haven't even taken an animal behavior course or cognition course. And so you're really starting from scratch. And so that can generate some really cool ideas and questions, but then you also have to like sort of catch up on the other stuff. But they definitely have big, broad interests, right? That come from the fact that they're also like, whatever, really involved in music on campus and like, taking English classes and all kinds of cool things.
And maybe it's a good opportunity to transition more into the science and talk about what you're doing and what you've done and maybe where your works have overlapped as well. So I found a few, just keywords wise, I know you've worked on kind of similar topics. To some degree, Ikuma transitivity, I think, Reggie, that's something that's been quite prevalent in your work. Ordering and our kind of natural inclinations to order things, I think you overlap in there.
Yeah. So
maybe I'll leave it up to you. I don't usually do this, but where do you want to start in thinking about the kind of work that you're doing these days?
Oh, that's
where it came from.
That's a hard question. I guess, the stuff I'm doing these days, I think falls into two major categories. So I came up in the kind of cognitive and comparative cognition world. And so I ask a lot of questions that are pretty much pure cognition. I think Ikuma has the same thing, right? About mechanisms of how animals solve certain tasks and what that means about how they think or how they learn or how they remember information. But then I also kind of have this, I don't want to say newer now because I've been doing this for a while, but another arm of my work that's more interested in kind of the intersection between behavior and cognition and what's going on in an animal's daily life and how does that relate to either how they perform on cognitive tasks or how they're able to learn or perform on cognitive tasks. So we kind of have these two parallel things going at the same time.
I think we recently, not that recent, a few months ago, we had Sarah Brosnan on the podcast and Ikuma was in the studio for that as well. And she mentioned something that overlaps a lot with something I heard you say the other day during your seminar, which is that sometimes if you just sit back, I'll paraphrase, sit back and watch the animals that you're studying in their own kind of social niche, a lot of things kind of jump out at you or become apparent. And maybe it was in the context of talking about transitivity, which I think we often think of in the context of competition, why an animal's need to understand to kind of rank order of other individuals. But your observation was that, but they don't spend most of their time doing that, right? Like being competitive or fighting, or they spend a lot of time affiliating. And so I wonder if maybe, so there's certainly some, I think, general patterns there, that what happens when you kind of watch the animals that you have access to. And I wonder if you could talk about that, how that's kind of inspired the different questions you've started to ask.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been very inspirational to hang out with the animals. So we're lucky at Bucknell that our primate colonies are housed in large social groups, but we're able to separate them out to test them. So it's actually kind of similar to the chimpanzees here at eHub. And that's one of the things actually that we talked about with my students in coming here, was that actually like the Bucknell way of doing things is pretty unique in the States, but it's actually not that dissimilar to how it's done here. So there's some similarities in their experiences across these two facilities. But because we have these animals housed in these big social groups, we're able to look at their behavior, and then we're also able to ask them cognitive questions in these controlled environments. And so, we started spending some time observing them. And that was something that, I've always been interested in behavior, but I did my postdoc at Zoo Atlanta with Tara Stawinski. And one of the things that I really learned from Tara was the value of behavioral data sets. Like, even when you're not sure what you're going to do with it, if you are watching your animals and you're recording what they're doing and you keep doing that, so many things can be answered from that data set. Like, it may be 10 years from now that you're going to sit down and look at it, but you have all of that information. And so when I started at Bucknell, the first thing we did was we set up a behavioral observation program, and we just started observing our animals all the time and collecting that data and then looking at it. It's just been so interesting and so informative, and so many questions have come out of it. And now that we have these big data sets, we know so much detail about the lives of each of these animals. We know their rank in the group. We know who they affiliate with. We know who initiates those affiliations, right? So we have directional data, which is really fascinating to us, because we have some animals who affiliate a lot, but like they're never the ones to initiate it. What is that telling us about them? We know how much aggression they receive. We know how much time they spend feeding, right? Just all sorts of little details. It has been very informative for us to think about those animals as individuals and how that plays into the cognition that they need to use day to day, or bigger things that we think relate to some human questions about how does the environment that you're in predict either how you learn things and or how you perform, because those are not the same, right? So we know from our students that you can study really hard for a test and know everything, and you can still bomb it, right? Right? It doesn't necessarily, performance and learning aren't exactly the same thing. And the same is true in animals, right? Like we know the environment can influence performance for many reasons, right? Social reasons. Animals might be reluctant to do something that's going to earn them a reward if they have a dominant animal standing next to them. There's tons of great data out there that show those kinds of things. And so we're really interested in looking at those questions, and we can now.
As a behavioral ecologist who studies wild primates and has for quite a while now, I mean, that's always been kind of my interest, is in how, what might be different between how the animals perform, whether they're on cognitive tests or just behaviorally, in a context like this, which is quite removed from the places they evolved. How would it kind of compare to the animals in the wild? And I think when you talk now, Reggie, about having the interest in studying social groups and their behavior, that's really fascinating to me. But I also wonder, what are the major challenges then of trying to transition a research program into doing it that way?
The transition, I think, at least to testing animals in a social group setting, I think is mostly just that it has to be voluntary when you do it that way. And so you often just lose a bunch of subjects that don't want to participate, right? So if you have animals in a lab environment where they're housed, let's say pair housed, and you have access to them at any point, your access is easy. The animals generally are enthusiastic about participating in research. When they have their whole social lives, as we've talked about, there's reasons they may not want to participate for social reasons or just because they don't want to participate, right? So they have other things going on. And we published a paper a few years back looking at the big testing system that we set up for the rhesus monkeys at Emory Primate Center. We had 4 touchscreen computers set up in an enclosure that had about 120 rhesus monkeys in it. And the monkeys all had RFID chips, so they could come up and use the touchscreens anytime they wanted. And we got data on, who was using it, when they were using it. And we were interested in looking at like who works and when do they work and how do the social dynamics influence who's working at the same time and things like that. And basically what we learned is like, yeah, all of those things matter. So seasonality, like breeding season and birthing season, the use of the touchscreens goes down dramatically. When an animal has a baby, they stop working for a while. So parity had a big role. The age of the individuals, who else is on the screens. So we found that if you looked at the peak working times in a given day based on rank in the group, they staggered themselves. So we'd have sort of a peak from the high ranking individuals and then a separate peak later in the day from the like sort of mid rankers, and then another peak at a different time of day for the low ranking animals. So it was just kind of cool to see that, like that all these things that we think probably influence who's going to participate and how they're going to participate do. But that's just stuff you have to figure out. You also lose some control. As Ikuma pointed out, like, when you bring them into a lab space where you have them by themselves in a space, you can control the lighting, you can control the sound, you can control the social environment. When you're testing animals in a big group, you don't have any of that control, or you have some of it. I mean, you can get some of it, but it's not quite as easy to get all of it.
Are there specific things then that you? This is kind of like a general question about almost what you're doing now to what happens next. But like, where do you see the major advantages, or what are the major questions that you think are kind of really important to answer when you think of the animals doing those, performing in the context of groups that you wouldn't have then when they're doing it in isolation?
I think for me, the thing that I'm most interested in is, we have like 80 years of amazing data on, say, learning. Okay. We know a lot about learning processes, basic learning, how it works in many different species, across species. But almost all of that data comes from animals by themselves. And it's great because we've been able to really characterize the mechanisms. But the reality is nothing in cognition evolved with an animal by itself, right? At least when we're talking about primates. So that learning or memory or whatever other cognitive process we're talking about evolved in the context of living in a group. And so I think where we're at now in the field is that it's on us to say, okay, so we know the basics of how these processes work, but how do they work in real life when you put them in a group and you put these animals together the way they would be living normally? And what does that tell us about the evolution of those processes? And I'm not to say I'm the only one doing this. A lot of people are trying to understand this better, but I do think that's where the field is headed, is in trying to now like take it out of the lab and put it, obviously I'm still in a lab, but put it in a little bit less of a controlled environment to start to understand how that might change, or how our understanding of those mechanisms might shift a little bit when we add the social context back in.
Do you then follow a lot of the kind of field cognition?
Yeah. And there's some awesome stuff. I mean, I have so much respect for anybody who can do field experiments. It's hard enough in the lab, like where I can like, choose the animals and I have like 24-hour access to them. I cannot imagine. You read some of these studies and you're like, oh, it took 5 years to get these animals to just happen to go where you needed them. It's so amazing. Yeah. So, and I think like, it's really cool to think about how these things will complement each other, because I think in the lab, right, the benefit there is the access to the animals. The benefit is the control that we can bring and the frequency with which we can do the cognitive research. In the field, of course, the benefit is they have a much more naturalistic environment. It's, they don't have veterinarians taking care of them. You can look at fitness, right, which we really can't look at in the lab in any real way. And generally the behavioral work is, much more extensive. So I think there's like these parts that both sides bring. And I do hope that like moving forward, there's a little more crosstalk, because I think, at least in primatology, there's always been this kind of distinction between like the lab folks and the field folks, right? There's not always a ton of overlap. But I do think we're heading to a time when we should be doing more of that.
Okay, Reggie, you've just given me an invitation. So when we stop recording, I want to talk to you about this.
Sounds good.
Maybe Ikuma knows where I'm going with that. Okay, where do I want to go here? This will probably be the first time I've ever done this on the PrimateCast, but I wonder if you're up for a little, we can call it a lightning round. It's not really a lightning round, but yesterday I asked Ikuma to put me in touch with your 4 undergrads.
Oh, good.
And they sent me a list of questions.
For me?
For you.
Oh, that's so fun.
There's way too many for me to actually read them out now. You've already
Did they prompt you with Bunny? They asked the bunny
they
question.
seated me
Yeah,
with Bunny.
okay. That makes sense.
Yes, in case you're wondering what the, but they had a really great set of questions, and so I thought maybe I could ask a couple of them.
Yeah.
And I'll just maybe randomly pick a few that I thought we've already covered some of the topics, but okay, so let's kind of go through a few. The first one, which I find kind of interesting, you've already talked about teaching and how it's really important to what you're doing at Bucknell. So what's your favorite course to teach at Bucknell?
Animal behavior.
Why animal behavior?
So it's the introductory course for our animal behavior major. The students take it in their first semester at Bucknell. And it's just such a fun class to teach, because it's a really broad class. So we cover, cognition, and we cover behavior from all levels, right? Proximate, ultimate. And it's just a very interactive class. So we do a lot of stuff. It's very data heavy, which I love. So we spend a lot of time looking at studies, and the students like talking through them. And since it's their first semester and it's their first chance to really get into it, particularly the ones that like animal behavior, get so excited. And so it's just like a really enthusiastic group. I just absolutely love teaching that class.
My answer is the same. I love my animal behavior
Do
class
you?
so
Is
much,
it also like first year students, or is it
It's
more
mixed.
advanced?
It's more geared toward first and second, but we even get some grad students in it. So
that's awesome.
It's a pretty mixed bag of domestic and international students, and it's a lot of fun. I do it flipped, so they're looking at lectures outside, and in the classroom we do problem sets. So it's a lot of kind of working through animal behavior problems.
It's really fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's super great, and we get to take them to Arashiyama.
Okay, that's cooler than what we. Well, we have our primates.
You have your own primate
Yeah,
lab,
it's true. We bring them
so-
to see the baboons, so we do have that.
Yeah. Okay, and then here's a really good one too to follow that up. Have you found any similarities between training primates and teaching students?
Of course. I mean, that's like not that makes students sound horrible, but that's not at all. I mean, like the processes of learning are the same, right? Like that's the whole point. So I do teach a learning course, which I also love to teach. And so much of that class is focused on the idea that like the basic principles of learning are the same, whether you're trying to raise a baby, or you're trying to train your dog, or you're training a monkey, or you're just trying to make your roommate less annoying, right? And I think that universality of learning processes is why they're interesting to study, right? So yes is the answer to that question.
Okay. tough one here. So one of the we talked earlier about, whether you're teaching undergrads or grad students and the probability or possibility that they will or will not go into the academy. And I think one of the things that weighs on a lot of us, I think as academics, especially as trainees in academia, is we feel a lot of pressure. And, that there's a huge epidemic of, anxiety, depression among graduate students kind of worldwide, which is not a surprise. And it's great that more and more people are open to talking about it. But one question we had from your undergrads was, do you struggle with imposter syndrome? And that's something we've talked about on this podcast before.
Yeah.
And I think it's a nice opportunity to have, established folks also talking about that. And I wonder.
It's such a good question. I don't know if I suffer from imposter syndrome exactly, because I think, as a scientist, part of it is that there's a lot of stuff you don't know, and that's okay, right? So I'm not I don't feel like I'm an imposter. I feel like I'm a scientist who knows a lot about some very specific topics, and there's other stuff I don't know that much about, and I'm always excited to learn more about it. So I think in some ways it's just reframing the fact that you do not have to be the person in the room who knows everything. No one is, right? It's just about some things and being open to learning from everybody else around you. I don't know. I think that's just the way to approach science. And then you don't feel bad about yourself. You're just oh, this is a learning opportunity.
It's hard to kind of, I think maybe not everyone models that very well, as professionals in our area. And there's a premium on your intellect, right? Or at least a perceived, especially traditionally. And so I feel like that's one of the more sensitive parts of it, is that we, a lot of that is out of the box. So, you can meet people who are just out of the box, really incredible thinkers. And then you meet people who work really hard at it. But most of us are just, somewhere in kind of between. And as you said, if it's a good way to approach it, that you understand what your limitations are and accept them. And then just the opportunities to grow that we have, which are maybe not seen in so many other fields, are really, really great.
Yeah, and I think, I'm a big proponent of collaboration in science, and part of why I'm here, right? Because we can't all be experts in everything, right? You can't have 7 PhDs and be an expert in all the things that you do. And so it's so valuable to work with people who know more than you do on a particular topic, right? And then you're bringing different things to the table. And some of the coolest projects we've done have been just these collaborations with people that are in totally different fields or work with different species or whatever. I'm sure you've had similar experiences, right? You just get to ask really cool questions and answer them using everybody's expertise and bringing it to the table. And I think a lot of my students will probably say this either to their benefit or not. A lot of the stuff I do in my classroom is collaborative work, because I just don't think science happens by yourself ever. Science is a team sport and you really need a team of people to make it work. And so when we're thinking through animal behavior problems in animal behavior, or designing experiments in my comparative cognition class, we're doing it in a group, because I just don't think you can really ask great questions by yourself.
And maybe, Ikuma, just to ask you, do you see in Japan, it's coming back to our original conversation about how science is done similarly and differently, and do you feel like in Japan too that there's a shift in the way people see their roles as scientists here? Or, because I know maybe this is not something that's as discussed.
Generally speaking, I completely agree with Reggie in the sense that, we cannot do everything by ourselves. We cannot be expertise in all area basically, right? But here, I think in Japan, at least it was more stressed on the point that you have to be an expert in something.
Yeah.
So it's like a flip side.
Yeah.
From the beginning, you don't say I should collaborate with everyone else.
Yeah.
But instead, you have to be a strong person in something. Then later on, the same thing happen, right? If you are strong in something, then you can be collaborate with some other stuff. So, in general, we are also leaning toward more collaborative works, and that's also why we are here together.
Yeah.
But previously, the philosophy-wise, I think they want to be someone in something. That's probably a little bit more stress in the Japanese culture, I think. And also there is a huge difference across how do you call different field in science. But especially in primatology, I think everyone in the previous year, I want to do everything by themselves in the beginning. But then, of course, now you have to have some strong point to be a good collaborator. So instead of having a good collaborator from the beginning, but just you need to be a good collaborator.
Yeah, you have to bring something to the
And
table.
for that, yes, that's a little bit different perception, but goal is, I guess, in the same thing.
Okay, really quick one. Which is worse, anthropomorphism or anthropodenial?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I can't answer that.
Can we get a pass?
I guess anthropomorphism.
Anthropomorphism?
Probably.
Why do you think so?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a complicated question. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, pass.
I mean, it's more like a fit to the critical thinking perception, at least, right?
Yeah.
Have to start with a doubt. Is that really so?
Yes.
But which doesn't mean the other side is always good either. Because sometimes like taking them as your own representative, for example, then you can better understand sometimes why that behavior happened. If I were you, I might think that way. We need to test it. So we don't just believe it. We just need to test it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, answer is intermediate always, but it's just without any belief, without any doubt, just believe that they are as we are. Then that's probably the wrong or worst. For me, at least.
That was a very good answer. I agree.
Do you have any funny stories of? I tried to do this last time with Ikuma and Sarah. They didn't really have a good answer. Any funny stories about? I did that with Susumu and Tesla Monsan as well. Any funny stories as grad student with Ikuma as a postdoc back in the Hampton days?
I think so. Is that horrible? I don't think I have any funny stories. I really can't.
It's your chance to embarrass each other on the
No,
air. Here.
I really don't have any. Nothing ridiculous. I feel like happened. We were a pretty stand-up lab, and that's our story. We're sticking to it.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, but I can still make one fun story out of it.
Okay, here we go.
Well, it's not related to science though. But people are not changing a lot that I found out after I welcome her here. When we are in the lab in Atlanta together, during the lunchtime, she always picked the bread and peanut butter on it almost everyday basis. Sometimes apple are added. But she's the one who is always okay to just, simplifying the lunch and then put more energy to the science or the class and those stuff. And now she's here in Japan. Every day she's doing the same lunch. And you don't want to eat anything else? Then she said, lunch is fine. Same.
It's the same. It's true. People don't change 20 years later.
Yeah, and sincerity toward those scientific approaches are always same in her too. Just reducing time or thinking about that. You still have a dinner, it has more bigger portions. So.
Nice.
But I mean, for lunch, just simplify it and then try to think about science more and more and more. Talking about students, I was amazed in a good way. I mean, and also give me some nostalgic memory. Same, huh?
Same.
Well, along the same lines, So you seem to have an inordinate affinity for Bucknell University.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
And so I wonder if you can comment on what was the process? You graduate from there with your undergrad and you end up now as faculty.
Yeah, that was not planned at all. I mean, if you had told 20-year-old me that I'd be back in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania for my life, I would definitely not have believed you. But, I think when you're in grad school, you spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to do with your life, right? And you change your mind weekly and then you decide you're going to be a florist or whatever, right? So, but I think what I realized through my grad experiences was I love research. I love being able to do research. I wanted to work with primates. I knew that. But I really loved teaching, and Rob was an amazing advisor, but, watching him in his career, it was clear to me I didn't want that particular career where so much of the focus was on grant writing. So little of the focus was on teaching. Teaching was a sort of side thing you had to do, sort of. I don't mean to imply that Rob didn't like to do it, but just that was sort of the perception there. And so when I started looking for jobs, I was looking for a place where I could work with primates and where I could teach. And there's not a lot of great options. And Bucknell's wonderful. And I think the thing that's unique about Bucknell, not unique, obviously, there's other schools like this, but we have what they call the teacher-scholar model, right? Which is this idea that we are both teachers and we are scholars. And the expectation is that you teach and that you have an active research program that engages your students. And that's not that common, right? So usually there's a heavy push on teaching or a heavy push on scholarship. So it's really cool that we get to do both. And so that was really what drove me there. And I've been happily there for 9 years now. 9 years, I guess.
Yeah. And I don't know if we can edit this out if it doesn't work, but you mentioned earlier that Peter Judge was retiring.
Yeah.
And that may be connected to the fact that Bucknell is hiring.
It is connected to that, yes. So
And I
Peter
wonder if you
Judge
want
is
to talk
retiring.
about that, and maybe we can help promote for you.
Yeah, totally. Happy to. Yeah. So Peter is retiring at the end of this academic year. So spring of 2024. So we will be hiring this coming fall of 23, for a new primate animal behavior person. Though it's a very open position. It's in fact an open rank search. So it doesn't have tenure, but we will consider people at any rank. The only requirement is that they work with the primates on campus. So we have a wonderful colony of primates, and we want to bring someone else in who can work with those animals and work with our students and work within this sort of teacher-scholar model that we have.
Mm-hmm. And I think basically the last hour we spent talking gives a good impression of what life and work is like there at Bucknell University. So for anyone interested,
and you can reach out to me. I'm chairing the search committee, so drop me an email.
Okay. So as we kind of close out here, before I ask you if there's anything we've missed, the one question I couldn't leave out from your students is what's it going to take for you to do karaoke with them?
Oh, there's no chance. Sorry.
All right, sorry, I tried. So is there anything else, Reggie, that maybe you want to circle back on, or that we didn't really talk about you think is important from this conversation?
I don't think so. What do you think?
We did okay?
I think we're doing okay.
So,
okay. Well then, Reggie Gazes, thanks so much for joining. Oh, there's one thing. Reggie, when I said your name, I just realized that in your email, I think you have a link to the pronunciation of your name.
Yeah, that's a thing in the States now.
I was pleasantly surprised by that. I'd never seen it before. So
yeah, it's becoming more common now. So that way, if you have a name that people mispronounce regularly or not, people don't really have a very good excuse for not just learning how to say your name properly. So it's been very helpful. People always screw up my last name. I know I screw up my students' names when you just see them in print for the first time and you don't know how to say it. So it's awesome to have that resource.
I like it. I mean, it gives a sense of inclusion as well, because it just, it really levels the playing field for folks who don't have the same background, same cultural understandings. I really like it. Yeah. So perhaps on my email address, you'll see that in the future as well. Reggie Gazes, thanks so much for joining us on the PrimateCast.
Thanks for having me.
Ikuma, as always, thanks for supporting. Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo. Formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.